Hey, welcome to module number 4 on the hazardous material and dangerous goods training. When we're done with this, we're halfway through this training. So module 4 is actually going to be the shortest module, I believe, unless I just go off on a rampant. And it is covering classification and data. So this is the way that you just kind of make sure that you have the right thing, because in your positions, you probably aren't doing the actual classification, but you are having to verify that that classification was done correctly by somebody else to the best of your ability. So on this module, and I'm sorry I don't have them up on the board, but we are going to be using 2 of the exhibits. We're going to be using exhibit number 3, which is just the one with the pictures of all the classes and the different labels and placards. It shows you the different colors. We'll kind of refer to those a little bit just for some identity purposes and some additional labels and markings that are on there. We talk about labels, markings in just about every module because everything kind of touches on that. And then we're going to talk about the data. And specifically the safety data sheets that we talked about before and what you can use those for and how you can check those for information, and why it's good to have them. So that's exhibit number 1. That's your first exhibit. It's 8 pages long. So don't know if you have a printed copy of it or looking at it, but we're going to kind of scroll through that and look at that and see kind of what you can find out there, what's helpful there, what's not very helpful there, what things clarify things, which things confuse things. So we're going to start, and again, this a lot falls back to the general awareness. Yeah, it's going to be important that we zone in on what commodities y'all are moving within your facility, but you also need to have a general awareness and know what other commodities are also. So we're going to run through this. I'll give you some examples of some things. I don't have examples for everything. Considering that I am our hazmat guy and have been doing it for all these years, I am not a chemist. So I don't have any experience even moving some of these commodities. So I may not be able to give you as much information as I'd like to. But so we're going to start on our presentation, which is for Module 4, which is the page that has some of the labels on the top and then all the numbers of the classes and divisions listed below it. And we start off with class number 1. And class number 1 are explosives. That's the general term for it. As you can imagine, explosives can be a lot of different things. Like I said, y'all's airbags used to fall into category 1.4. Most have been moved to miscellaneous 9, but they were a 1.4. The thing you got to know about explosives, they can run from things that are like extremely explosive item, like a missile or a bomb or some things like that, which would fall under a 1.1. And you've got things that are like a toy cap, like from a cap gun, still explosive if the right thing hits it or whatever. So sometimes some things have some really unusual properties that you might not think of it as worth doing it. But, you know, if you had a container full of caps and those little red rolls of caps or whatever, and that container dropped or another container dropped on top of it and it got totally smashed, it could blow up. You know, you get enough of those things going off at a certain time, it can ignite a fire, it can do a lot of different things. So my experience is, you know, as a boy of having we were poor, so I didn't have the gun anymore. So I just had the caps and I would hit it with a hammer or take the whole roll and hit the whole roll with the hammer, and then the hammer would kind of jump back. So you saw it a little more explosive. So So you've got 6 different divisions under Class 1. And there's a lot more awareness of the different divisions than they used to be. And a lot of that is thankful because of airbags. In the old days, anything that was a Class 1, you could only ship that. You can only receive it in certain points and ship it out certain ports. And on the West Coast, it was one up right outside of Wilmington. There was a place called Cape Fear, appropriately named, but that's where the military sent out a lot of their goods. And they're the ones that have a lot of the Class 1 explosive items. On the West Coast, it's Sunnyvale or Sunny something. I always forget the name. The other one was, I think Sunnyvale is the name of the town in War Games where they had the Defense Department and he stole the data from, he was hoping to get a good video game for global thermonuclear war. If I'm aging myself, I know. That was an early 80s movie. So, so the Class 1s, certain port authorities can't accept them. Choose not to. Certain truck lines, of course, can't. Steamship lines won't on some cases, but warehouses, some are insured and licensed to be able to handle Class 1 items. Most of them aren't. So you got to be very specific on there. And if they're not, tell you a little story about another automobile manufacturer that had, we're bringing in airbags for the cars they were assembling here, manufacturing and assembly here. And so the parts would come in when they were shipped over from Europe. Airbags were 1.4. So they came in with the marking of an explosive label as 1.4. Well, they had them there, they kept a stockpile of them or whatever for production. Well, the new airbags were developed that were safer. They were re-regulated to become a Class 9 as a miscellaneous, made things a lot easier for them to ship it, a lot less costly on the way they needed to package it, things like that. So they eventually incorporated these new airbags as a Class 9 into their production. So what they did was they got rid of all the old ones. Now, what they were going to do was they decided not to destroy them. One, because it's very expensive to destroy hazardous goods in any country. So what they decided to do is they would ship them back because they still produced models of that car in their country that were sold domestically. So they wouldn't have to ship them out. So they still could use the airbags. They were still perfectly fine. They just weren't the latest model. So they ordered for us. They had about a container load full. So they got in touch with us because they don't usually return stuff and do things like that. So they called us up and they said, okay, we've got a shipment of some airbags that are going back. They're Class 9. Here's the UN number. Everything was fine. What they were doing was they were moving them out of their facility. It was a ways away from the port, a little further than y'all are, I believe. So they were bringing them in a trailer to the Charleston area, and it was a lot cheaper than to send an empty container all the way out there and bring it back because they didn't have rail service. They didn't really work with containers that much, but they had us arrange for a warehouse to receive the goods from a truck, like a 53-foot trailer here in Charleston, offload them, and then we would bring in an empty container to that warehouse, and they would stuff them in that container, ship them out by ocean. We do it all the time. It's basically called cross-docking, if you don't know the term. So we made all the arrangements. Everything was done. All the bookings were accepted. Everything, was in order. Well, it gets to the warehouse, and the driver is offloading his container onto the dock. And the guy's receiving it and checking everything off or whatever. And the manager of the warehouse, who was actually the owner also, came walking by just as they were finishing up. And he walked by and stopped and goes, whoa, what is this? And he goes, it's the shipment for so-and-so with John S. James is handling. And he goes, yeah, but these are marked 1.4 explosives. And he goes, yeah, I don't know. it's just a bunch of airbags. I know that it's airbags. Well, yeah, the description's correct, but these are marked 1.4 and this was booked as a class 9. The guy goes, I'm not licensed or insured to hold class 1 explosives. I can't accept them. You need to load them back into your truck. And the driver goes, okay, let me call my dispatch, find out what I need to do and what they want me to do with it. And he said, okay. The driver goes and gets in the truck and then just drives away and leaves the explosive material, the 1.4 material, sitting on their dock. So the guy wasn't real happy with this. He calls me up and he's very upset. He's very nervous. We've done a lot of business before, totally understood how it happened. He goes, but y'all have got to get another truck in here and get it out of here. He goes, if I have my insurance inspector here, I will be shut down. I will have so many penalties. I will have to pay all these premiums, things like that. He goes, we got to get this done. And so it's like 3 o'clock. And so we start making the arrangements. And so then the question comes up, how do you move something that was moved wrong in the first place? Because everything I have shows it's a class 9. And they're showing it's a 1.4 on the product. Our customer, they go back to Europe the next morning to get an answer. The guy was not happy and had to sit there overnight. So he's on the phone to me the next morning. I get a call, or I call my customer and they said, yeah, well, we talked to Europe and Europe says, oh no, all airbags are a class 9 now. And I said, well, no, they're not. You can't reclassify something. That's in the regulations. Once it's been classified a certain way, it's always that class with it, unless you totally remark the product. So we're going back and forth. The guy from the warehouse is calling me 3 times a day for 2 days because I couldn't find anybody that would touch a 1.4 because they had provided a newer safety data sheet that didn't match either. We were trying to get all that fixed, but the only solution is we had to move it as a 1.4 now. So I had to find a warehouse that could accept it, a truck line that it could accept it, a steamship line that would accept it for all these things. And these things don't happen overnight. I mean, they take 48 hours for approval. So on the 3rd day, I finally got approval for everything. And I called the warehouse guy and I was like, Jimmy, I said, I've got some good news for you. I've got someone picking up. And he goes, okay. And I go, wait a minute, why haven't you called me today? I go, you've been calling me 3 times every day on this saying it has to be moved. It has to be moved. And he goes, yeah, well, we kind of found a solution here that, bought us some time. I said, really? What was it? He goes, well, we just put it in the back corner of the warehouse and we built a whole wall of cargo so all of it was hidden, that you would never see it, and kind of disguised it behind there. I was like, okay, creative. It is just airbags or whatever. So, but we ended up going in there and we had to get all new paperwork from the customer. But it's just one of those little things that it's like, okay, once something goes wrong in your middle of the transport, how do you fix it? You can't just go in and slap new labels on it. First of all, no one will just slap labels on anything unless you've got a great arrangement. Now, I know Mercedes, I've heard before about, the steamship line's not going to like this. And they're like, yeah, but they like having our business than not doing it. So they'll bend the rules for us. But sometimes with the hazmat, it's hard to get those rules bent. So just so you know, so we've done different cross-dock operations for people that something's going out wrong with the wrong paperwork or incorrectly labeled, and we have to make this arrangement that the labels are actually sent to us and things like that, and then they're applied and the whole thing is filmed, and but it can get very tricky. So class 1 explosives, you want to be accurate. One, just because everyone has their eyes up going, it's explosives. This is really some bad stuff, but there's a lot of explosives that aren't that bad. Class 1.3 is we have a customer that actually ships quite. They're actually the largest manufacturer of pyrotechnics in the world. They hold the world record for some of the largest things that they've ever had. It's a real difficulty because some of their things are a 1.4, but some of them of the big explosive devices are 1.3s because they're like miniature bombs basically going off in the sky. And a lot of carriers won't carry 1.3, 1.1, 1.2. So, and then you've got different ports that might not accept it. So just because the Port of Charleston says, sure, I can load a 1.3, well, that ship goes from Charleston and then goes to could go to other U.S. ports up the coast. New York may have a rule that they don't accept certain commodities in, but then when it goes overseas, all the ports that it hits before it gets to its final destination has to give approval for that ship to come in with explosives on it. So, and that does take a while. The big one is we have a real hard problem, and a lot of their stuff is held in the Middle East, in Dubai, United Arab Emirates. But you got to go through the Strait of Gibraltar, and the ships almost always pass through Algeciras or stop in Algeciras. And Algeciras has very strict guidelines. As a matter of fact, in order to get the permits, it could be $50,000 to get the permits just for one container to move on a ship to get through there. So a lot of work goes behind explosives. That's why you had certain steamship lines that just had a policy, we're not accepting any class 1s. We're not going to take a chance, and we just don't do it. So the next class up is class number 2. And class number 2 are your gases. The thing that are unique about class number 2, they're gases. So gases, they don't have a packing group because they're all in cylinders. Of course, there's only one way to package gas so that it doesn't escape. So there is no 1, 2, or 3 there. They're all in those cylinders, and those cylinders have their own standards of what they have. So it's like a whole nother ball game. So your article's pressurized pneumatic, your 2.2, it's not going to have a packing group. So don't get shocked. The shipping papers, things look a little bit funny because you're like, well, where is it? Where is it? Isn't one on there? So so class 2 is basically split up into 3 sections, and then it has one separate little commodity all by himself. But you've got 2.1, which are flammable gases. So think of like, an aerosol. Like you've got like a hairspray and you spray and, you light the lighter and it lights on fire or whatever. Class 2.1s are a little bit tricky especially when you're talking about air freight. Because the problem with class 2.1s is that they're in these cans or receptacles, and air freight is all pressurized. So they want to make sure the settings are correct so that you don't have things blowing up on the plane or in a container if the pressure goes off. The same thing with certain heat. When you ship ship goods in a container and it's traveling across the ocean, remember that ship is constantly moving. So your product is always kind of jiggling, and that kind of creates a little bit of heat and friction. And then you've also got added to that, you've got inside those containers when it might be 110 degrees out there on the water, depending on where they are, the temperature inside those containers can get to be over 150 degrees. And if anything's flammable, any kind of friction of anything over 140 degrees is going to light on fire. So you've got to have very careful packaging for the 2.1s because they're flammable, and that would just take off like a bomb. You've also got those ones that, the compressed gas on those superhero movies or whatever, if the guy that's like knocking off the thing and shooting it as a rocket, things like that, or catching it on fire, blowing them up in movies. Doesn't really work like that in the real life, but it's kind of fun to watch in the movie. So those are the red, makes sense, red, flammable. So if you see the 2.1 and it's red, you see a class 2, it's a flammable gas, kind of makes sense. The 2.2, which y'all do deal with, are those green labels you might see, and you see a cylinder on it, and it's a non-flammable gas. And I used to do a lot of this back when I represented an air conditioning company. And so a lot of their air conditioners, the larger ones used for hotels and things and hospitals, had Freon pumped into the air conditioning. And if you had over 22 pounds of Freon in the machine, the whole machine was considered hazardous. So this was a little bit tricky because at one time Singapore had an incident about 25, 30 years ago where flammable 2.1 caused an incident on the port. And so they forbid all class 2 products. So Singapore is a big transshipment port into Southeast Asia. So they had a really hard time getting some of their goods routed until they were able to, and it took about a year to convince Singapore to allow 2.2 to go back in. So on the outside world, or people that aren't in the hazmat world, they think of class 1 is just an explosive, and an explosive is an explosive. Class 2, a gas is a gas. They think of whatever gas they may think. Because then you get to the 3.3, and that's the black and white one. That is the toxic gases. And those are gases when they are emitted into the air, they can cause an inhalation hazard. And there's even special labels to reinforce that, showing it's an inhalation hazard. Like, not all toxic gases are inhalation hazards. Pretty much most of them are, though. This is the worst of the worst. And I mentioned last time that the 2 times we had DOT inspections in our office was when we moved an actual 2.3 toxic substance, and it was an inhalation hazard, and they wanted to make sure that we had all of our information in order. Because there's several different zones. Don't go into that. It gets a little bit complicated, but which is something good to know, that if I've got some toxic materials that could, when they're released, cause gases to come up. Even some liquids can cause that in certain temperatures, of course. But these toxic gases, if they get out, they need to know who needs to be evacuated and what kind of, how they do it. You know, walking up to a cylinder that has Freon in it, or walking up to your seatbelt pretensioners, you know, is a whole different way than you're walking up to a tank that is flammable or has toxic gas in it, and you think there could be a leak. And little oxygen has their own little label. I think it's different just to help to identify it. So when you're out on the road, you're behind one of those trucks that's that open truck, and you see it's just filled with cylinders. You don't think that much about it until you really start looking, and you see that there are some flammables on there. There are some non-flammables on there. You may have some oxygens on there. Those trucks scare me because they usually are kind of covered with rust, and they're it seems like the cylinders are hooked together with a chain and security. So I don't follow those. I try to get out of their way as quickly as possible. But so class 2 are all your gases. So usually pretty big stuff, but you're moving the stuff that's really not considered that hazard. It's the non-flammable gas. So now three is flammable liquids. In the world out there, you see a class 3 label or placard more than any other. You may not notice it or think about it, and it's just become part of the background. But every gasoline truck has a class 3 placard on it. So you'll start noticing these a little bit more now that you see it. Gasoline is UN number 1203. You'll start getting used to, because you'll see that UN number, and maybe it's me because I'm kind of a nerd. So, so class 3 is flammable. Now you've got different levels of things being flammable, and they fall into different packing groups depending on what the flash point is. So if you've got something with a pretty low flash point that, you know, at 0 degrees Fahrenheit, if it's 0 degrees and you go to ignite it or put a spark to it and it catches on fire, that's pretty flammable stuff. You get into like gasoline, it needs to be at a temperature of, say, like 75 degrees or whatever it is, of whatever the kind of grade of gasoline it is. And basically, and then a packing group 3 is a lot lower. It's a lot harder for like some of your paints and things like that. And that's one of those, I didn't understand flammable liquids when I first started in this business, because I would read something and it was like the flash point is 68 degrees. So I was like, well, wait a minute, it's 74 degrees outside. Isn't this thing going to catch on fire? Well, it's only flammable if it emits, if you have a spark or you put a flame on it, then it'll catch. So I always say, like, sometimes when you're watching in these movies and you see the gas filling out from the hose on the thing and somebody drops something and immediately it all catches on fire and blows up. And a lot of times that would never happen unless it's a certain temperature. Sort of think of when you're pumping gas on a really hot day in the summer and you look down at your hand and the nozzle and you see the gases coming off. It's the heat that's emitting it. It's that gas that really catches fire. It's not really the liquid. It's that gas that's coming off of it. So, most times if you think about it, if you took a match and threw a match into a can of paint, the paint is flammable, but only when it gets up to a certain temperature, and it's usually not at that temperature. So it just kind of depends on what it is. But you will see a lot of flammables out there, and you'll notice them more on the road of seeing those class 3s. Y'all do have paint in your facility. Y'all do paint the cars, which is nice. So you are bringing in the paint supplies, which I'm sure you're bringing in sizes that are considered hazardous, depending on what kind of paint it is and what is in the mixture. And like I said, there can be some that are flammable, some that aren't flammable. It just kind of depends on what the chemical properties are of that. Then you go to your class 4, and 4 is kind of a funny little class. They're solids, but they're flammable. So, okay, what does that really mean? A solid flammable at first, like a 4.1 is a flammable solid that can self-react and can explode. You kind of think of that as like coal can be that. It can be like a kitchen match, safety matches, things like that. So it's a solid, but it can catch on fire. So, and if spark is admitted to it, it'll catch on fire. You've got 4.2, which is those can spontaneously combust, which that's kind of scary because that's usually in some kind of horror movie that someone spontaneously combusts. But an example of that would be things like oily cotton or hay. Hay is also something that is a flammable solid. And what it is that they're banded so tight, it's putting pressure on all the little tiny points in there. And the hay does have some oil in it. The cotton has some oil. You can picture that. And when it's raw cotton, they bundle it up. They put it into a box that's transporting it. It starts shifting and moving, and that's going to generate a little bit of heat, some little thing on one of the bands or whatever, or with the cotton material, a little tiny spark goes off, huge fires. Some of the biggest incidents we've ever had was because of hay and because of cotton in this country for hazardous. And then 4.3, which is kind of scary if you're shipping it ocean, it's flammable solids, which when it comes in contact with water, it emits flammable gases. So if it gets wet, then these gases start coming off. And then if a spark is hit on it, it can catch on fire. So sounds pretty scary on the ocean side of things, of that happening. But those have very specific marks. Dangerous when wet is basically what that one's known as. So you've got your multicolored red ones for your 4.1 and 2, and then you've got that little blue one all by itself, which is the dangerous when wet. And that's one of those classes a lot of people don't like to accept also, because they're usually pretty hazardous stuff. Class 5 is what I know least about. They are oxidizing and organic peroxides. Basically, they react to other substances. So I think of like a hydrogen peroxide that under class 5, 2 divisions. But you think of hydrogen peroxide, okay, that's fine. I've got it in my bathroom or whatever. I use it on wounds or whatever. But if you've poured it on a wound, it starts to bubble up. It has a reaction to other chemicals or other substances. So that's fine because the hydrogen peroxide that's in that bottle, if you read it, it's 97% water, 3% hydrogen peroxide. Now you get up to some mixtures that are over 10% or maybe 50% or 100%, they could be extremely hazardous. A lot of your pool chemicals can be hazard under oxidizing type of thing. You've got the reaction with like OxyClean. It's an oxidizer. It basically goes in and just mixes with the water and the agitation, and it creates all these bubbles, and it pops out the dirt molecules in between your fabric, things like that. So those can be some of your class 5s. Again, because they react with other substances, a lot of people don't like to carry them. So I don't like that one much either. The class 6 are poisons. And class 6, we call them poison. They call them toxic in everywhere else in the world. So we've got different ones. We've got just the 6.1, which those are things like pesticides are probably a good example of what those are. Fall into the 6.1, harmful, cyanide, things like that, strychnine, those are poisons. Simple thing of a poison. Like I said, the word toxic is used more internationally. We still are a little bit hooked on poison, but we're getting used to toxic a little bit more. So some of these become inhalation hazards. So some of these things that there can be liquid, they can react, they can, if they're liquid, of course, fumes can be formed under a certain heat, and then they become a gas and they become an inhalation hazard. So 6.1s you have to watch out for also. But we do ship a lot of 6.1s of just regular poison items. So, but that's just something you always want to check. If you see a 6.1, you want to check to see if it's an inhalation hazard or not. And to find that out, it's in the special provisions, actually. The first 6 special provisions, if it's special provision 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6, it means it's an inhalation hazard. So doubt you'll ever run across that, but if you ever do, you'll see and understand it. 6.2 is a nasty thing. It's called infectious substances. So my first question was, why are we shipping infectious substances to other people? Hospitals, universities do a lot of research on things like Ebola. The AIDS virus are examples that are shipped from one to another. There's certain samples they have. They have extremely stringent packing requirements, as you would think, because you wouldn't want it released because it's infectious substances. I am sure there's a lot going on right now with people shipping COVID-19 samples back and forth between the different hospitals, universities, testing sites, things like that. Those would be considered infectious substances. Those are, they don't have a packing group either, because there's only one way to pack them safely. It's more like they're in their container than they're in a bag, and within that bag they're in another container, and outside of there it's a reinforced box. And I always think of the things that you move. You get like your Omaha steaks in the little old styrofoam coolers. That's kind of what that inner packaging, one of the inner packaging is in something like that. So, and then you can have, again, they have different packing groups, 1, 2, and 3. It's one of those that, some things are just a little bit poisonous, some things aren't. Something I thought was interesting, because this is, and this was back, probably about 15 years ago. We were doing, the product Roundup, that is the weed killer that Monsanto makes. Well, they were about to, their patent was almost up. And so you had companies that were looking to manufacture this when the patent opened up in China for about 1/10 the cost of what Monsanto was selling it for. So they were looking at some great opportunities, and we were doing a lot of background work for them for about a year before it started. And they were herbicides. And so my big thing was, okay, can you give me the hazardous information or whatever? And they said, this isn't hazardous. And I said, Yeah, I mean, it's a herbicide. I mean, it kills plants and kills whatever. And he goes, right, it kills plants. It doesn't kill people. He goes, you can actually drink this stuff. And I go, well, I wouldn't, but it shows you kind of where that was. Now, some of those have changed, some of the herbicides, because we are now protecting the environment more, and there's more things classified as environmentally hazardous substances, which I'm sure most of the herbicides have been reclassified to that. But for a long time, it was perfectly fine to ship herbicides, and if they fell out, it would just kill the plant life around it, but wouldn't affect people. So just kind of interesting, I thought. So the next one that we're going to run across is Class 7. Now, Class 7 is something that y'all should not be moving. Y'all should not be having in there. If you do, please somebody let me know. Class 7 radioactive material. There's different levels of it. Radioactive could be pretty scary stuff, shipping some plutonium somewhere around the world. Don't think you're going to be able to get an export license to do it. But then you've got simple things like a smoke detector has a small bit of an isotope in it, so it is considered radioactive. So you've got to have proper packaging there to make sure that that isotope is safe in there. So be careful now when your smoke alarm is going off and you just want it to go off in the middle of the night and you grab a baseball bat to knock it off the ceiling. Probably wouldn't do that. Not the smartest thing, but again, it's unless you knock it off and that exact isotope goes into your eye, you're probably fine. But it could. So Class 7, the thing about Class 7s are you need very specific training and certification to handle Class 7 materials in any way. Preparing the shipping papers, doing the transport of it. Only certain carriers will move Class 7. And if they do, there's no problem to it. We do have a customer. I am radioactive certified. I was actually a little bit nervous to get it done. I'm like, would I be able to do this and figure it out? I don't know chemistry. It wasn't bad. It's just another set of rules. So then you've got class number 8 is corrosives. Y'all do have corrosives. You battery people, you better get used to these labels. Class number 8, a lot of your batteries are corrosive. In there, batteries is one of those terms. It was kind of like paint. There were paints that were hazardous and not hazardous. Well, the same thing with batteries. And then it even falls into, there are many, many classifications for different types of batteries, which I'm sure y'all have already seen. So we're going to go over this a little bit in the automotive part, well, more than a little bit. But and I know there's a lot of battery work going on there with the new battery plant. So this is a pretty important thing for y'all to get down and learn as much and actually read the regulations on what determines whether or not it is a class 8 or a class 9, or if it's hazardous or not hazardous, or what the exact description of, because there is someone. You've just got the one placard or label there for class 8. But in the regulations, one of the things I didn't really mention is in the regulations, and what makes them so thick is they tell you the exact testing and what has to be done to determine whether or not it falls into that class. It's like the boiling point and the closed cup test to see if something's flammable. Well, class 8 being corrosive, they still have the description there of the old way and the way it's still done now with some, in that materials are actually still put on, say, the skin of a live rabbit to see how quickly the skin dissolves. And that determines whether or not it's considered a corrosive material or not. Sorry to throw that in, but this is where you want to be a little bit careful of how much you read and how much you dig into, because sometimes you don't want to know some of the things that you're going to see. So just telling you. Class 9 are when things don't fall into any of the above, they fall into class number 9. And class 9 is becoming a little bit more bigger and bigger. One, because all the environmental things are falling under class 9. You've got things that are, yes, they are hazardous. They don't really fit the definition. Dry ice is one. I believe it used to be a 4-point 2 or something like that, with considered a solid, even though it really didn't fit in there. It was the best one. They made Miscellaneous. So you're starting to see some things fall in there a little bit more. Class 9, some of them have packing groups, some of them don't. So it just kind of depends. You've got some that, like Asbestos is a packing group 2. So I'm sure it's because of its bad asbestos. I already mentioned that in the previous module. So, so class 9, you've got your little black and white with the little stripes on it or whatever to identify. Y'all should be very familiar. There should be several different products in your facility that are class 9. Some additional markings, one that's gone away is the ORMD. I don't know if it's still out there or not. That was for consumer commodities. We won't really get into that. We've got the diamond shape there with the white in the middle and the 2 black tips. That's for limited quantities that certain markings and placards would go on there. So it's kind of like neutral, meaning that it really isn't hazardous. You got like empty stickers, overpack stickers. Empty could be like when there's residue. We'll talk about that in another one. Whether it's an inhalation hazard, there's just some additional markings that can go on your product. So, and then for air, there's a little bit more, because remember these regulations also do go over domestic air things. So the main ones to look at, you notice that same black and white diamond, but for air freight, it needs to have a Y in the middle. And then you have the cargo aircraft only. If you can't go on a passenger flight, I'll explain all that in the IATA training. Different ones of don't stow in direct sunlight because it can heat up, things like that. Orientation arrows, you don't want it near magnets, things like that, just to help out that could do something or whatever. So, but a lot of different markings, a lot of different labels that come from depending on what kind of class you have. So that's kind of why we go through that. So next, I'm going to go to our next slide that we have is the Hazardous Communication Safety Data Sheets. And this is where your example number 1, if you want to pull that out, your exhibit number 1, and I will look for mine. Wherever it is, I have this ready. Here you go. All right. So a safety data sheet, basically everyone is required who does chemical manufacturers, distributors, importers, they have to provide this safety data sheet. Used to be known as the Material Safety Data, SDS, it was the MSDS. It changed on 2015. Slowly, they've given people a lot of time to fix it and get it done. But what's nice about them now, they used to be totally freeform. So when you go to look for something, I could never find it, or it would be really difficult to find some of the stuff on here. But what I'm looking at is for on here is just to give me what information I need. Now, if you look at this, Section 1 talks about the identification. Okay, what is this? You know, who's the manufacturer? What's its name? What's its CAS number? Things like that. You're not going to really need this on what you're doing. You've got your hazards identification. This might be something you look at because it kind of lists what's actual the composition, and that's in Section 3. Section 2 could be hazard identification. It can tell you certain things that could happen. Section 4, first aid measures. You've got some Section 5 of firefighting measures. These are all great for incidents. If there's an incident in your facility, yeah, your safety department should have the safety data sheets for all of these. Accidental release measures, what happens if some of the gas gets out or some of it gets out? What do you need to do? Handling and storage, how should you storage? You know, it might say do not put on a rack, any rack that is higher than 8 feet tall, something like that. Keep out of direct sunlight, keep away from a window. exposure controls, personal protection that you should wear if you're handling it, physical and chemical properties. This goes into some details, stability, reactivity. See, all this stuff now gets in over my head. So if you start reading all this stuff, any chemical whatsoever is going to sound real bad when you start reading section 10 through 13. Disposal is good if y'all do have, if you're doing waste products or how you're doing that. But the section that I am concerned about, section 14. Section 14 gives you the transport information. So if you're looking at your exhibit and you go through and you get to section 14, and it's on page 7 of 8 on the top. And these are some safety devices. These aren't your safety devices. They're for another automobile manufacturer. I hope you can't find their name on it. I might have left it somewhere. But what the transportation information tells you is, okay, I've got these safety devices. Here's what the manufacturer says needs to be done according to the different regulations. So they use the HMDG, which is the local country in, I won't tell you the country because you'll tell what it is, but basically their hazardous regulations, so it's their domestic regulations. You've got HMDG and IATA. The nice thing for safety devices, they match all of them. Every now and then you might have a little bit of a difference on domestic, ocean, and air. It's not a lot, but that's why you need to check, because some of them have a section. I've seen some that are wonderful that have 3 sections on every one of theirs and gives you every one for each one, even if it's the same. Those are, I really like. I wish they would have gone to that format for everybody. But so it's telling you what your UN number is. It's telling you the proper shipping name, which is safety devices. They even got it down exactly as it is in the book. If you notice, safety devices in Roman type. And the electronically initiated are, it can be part of the name. It doesn't have to be part of the name. The dangerous goods class, it's a class 9, which that's what we thought it was. That's good. It's miscellaneous. The packing group, there is no packing group here. So we don't have to worry about a packing group on these safety devices. Then I don't have, if there's packing groups not applicable, then I have the EMS number, which is the emergency response measures. It's got an F/B, FS/X, so it's going to tell you what to do in those incidents if there's an incident. The HazChem code, I don't even know what that is. It does tell you what the special provisions are. That's kind of nice, but the special provisions for what? It's probably the special provisions for HMDG, if I had to guess. Limited quantities, it says you don't have 0. And then the packaging and IBCs and packing instructions, you see it says P902 and LP902. We're going to get into those on the next module. But as I kind of referred, if it begins with a P, it came from HMDG. So I am sure those are the special provisions for the HMDG. This is the section I want to look at. It just makes sure when I'm doing the shipping papers, it's what I have. The rest is really used for your safety department and your hazmat department to make sure that they know what to do in case there's an incident. They can use this to help pick out the packaging that it needs to tell you what it needs to go into. So regulatory information, I forgot, that's what it is. Australian Inventory of Chemical Substances, that's the ADG. And then schedule for uniform schedule of drugs and poisons, whatever. That's where they comply with their regulations. This is obviously a safety data sheet out of Australia for their facilities. So and it's not an Australian car dealer, so don't try to figure out who it is. So, but you can see it's got a lot of information. But if you look at, you go back looking at it. You go back to say page number 6 of 8, the previous page, and we're in section number 11 here, which is the toxicological information. And just looking down at safety devices and, skin corrosion irritation, causes skin irritation, serious eye damage, causes serious eye irritation. Germ ecology based on so-and-so, this criteria is not met. Well, that's good. Possible carcinogenic to humans. So some of this goes into some details that it sound like these are like horrible commodities. You're like, oh my God, I don't want to touch these things. It's saying all these terrible things that can happen. It's a safety device. It's an airbag, or it's a seatbelt retentioner. But when you get into some of the details, sometimes reading it doesn't mean that just because it says something is environmentally hazardous doesn't mean it's an environmental hazard or marine pollutant, which we'll talk about. So you can't read too much into here. You really have to get this information from the transport information. SDSs, everyone should know where they're kept, what the policy is, just because sometimes you can just find some of this information that you might need. And the Appendix D of 191.1200 has a detailed description of what these contents should have. Since you're not preparing these, I wouldn't worry about that right now, but as you can see, the guidelines up above of what those sections are. So I tell my employees, just so you know, the ones that are handling the goods, doing the shipping papers, working within the warehouse, you want to see section number 14. That's what you're looking for. Now, occasionally, and when I say you want to see section 14, you will see section 14 somewhere else. Now, there are some things that if you're dealing with a flammable liquid, the question is, okay, where do you find the flash point? The flash point could be in two different areas. Sometimes it's in section 5 in firefighting measures. Sometimes it's in section number 9, the physical and chemical properties. Sometimes you have to look. More than likely, you're not having to look because it should be on the document that you received the goods on. So it should be in your system already and already set. So that was a lot of talking about really general stuff. But like I said, that's a big core of building blocks on this, because next we're going into a little bit more detail of what we do and what we actually are going to be able to use on your job, supposedly. You've got the dangerous goods declaration, which we're going to go into detail of what every field is and what that information is. Again, it has got 22 fields, actually really about 30 different fields. Really simple though, if you know what you're doing and you understand it. And then we're going to talk about in the next module, shipping papers, which are pretty important too. And then we'll get to the packing, marking, and labeling. So this is the end of module 4 on the hazardous material and dangerous goods. You are halfway through, so congratulations on that. More videos will be posted soon, so keep an eye on it. And please check your emails, because I'll be continually update on any information for you. Again, any kind of questions, anything that you have, please shoot me an email or show up at one of our review classes every day at 3 o'clock. Have a great day.